How's it going, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to go over a paper version of my Hapatra Vizier of Poisons deck that I actually put out the other day on Historic Brawl. But this version is actually much more consistent and much more powerful than what's available on Arena because of the long history of cards that have been in Magic that deal with -1/-1 counters, because we don't go back far enough in Arena for it to work. I called the deck Snakes on a Plane when I built it because the idea was to drop Eldrazi Monument with a bunch of snakes out and fly over and hit them with a bunch of little doinks. So in this case, we're going to actually make our opponents say,
I have had it with these mother snakes on this mother plane.
Now, some of these suggestions are actually going to be kind of budgetary type things because some of the cards that go into the -1/- counter stuff are very expensive because they were printed in things like Shadowmoor and Eventide, and those sets just were not opened as much. So there's actually kind of a shortfall available of those cards. And then there's also some cards that are way back from like the Mirage block. So I'll tell you when there's things that are kind of pricier. First up is Fume Spitter. For a black, you get a 1/1 horror that you can sacrifice it at will to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature. It's just a great little thing to block with and then throw a counter on something in the process. So then you can go ahead and get a snake off of Hapatra. Next, we have Virulent Wound. For a black, you get an instant that puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature. And when the creature is put into the graveyard, the controller gets a poison counter. Now, I'm not really caring about the poison counter part of this card. It's just about putting the -1/-1 counter on the creature to get a snake token off of it. Here we have a much more expensive variation of that. Instill Infection. For 3 and a black, you get an instant that says put -1/-1 counter on a creature, draw a card. So you can, you get your negative counter, but then you also get a card out of it as well. Then we have Grim Affliction, which is a slightly better variation of that last card. For 2 and a black, you get an instant, put a -1/-1 counter on a target creature, and then proliferate. So if you already have some negative counters floating around on your opponent's stuff, then you get to add an additional negative counter. Or you can bolster up planeswalkers on your side of the board, or you can bolster up your +1/+1 counters if they happen to have any poison counters on them, because there are a few infect creatures that I would put into this deck, but the goal is not to poison our opponents out unless we absolutely need to. Speaking of the infect creatures, this is one that in particular that I would use. It's Core Prowler. For 4 colorless, you get a 2/2. It's actually a Phyrexian horror because it's actually been updated. It has Infect, and when Core Prowler is put into a graveyard from anywhere, proliferate. And that's the main reason why I have it here, because the fun thing is you can block with it. It'll put the 2 negative counters on your opponent's creature. It'll die, and then you can proliferate off of that. So it actually puts 3 negative counters on something, and it triggers twice for Hapatra, once for the Infect damage and once for the proliferate. Now this one might be a little controversial. This is Tainted Strike. For a black, you get an instant. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Infect until end of turn. Now, I'm not huge on this being a controversial card in this deck because of one thing. Most of the creatures in this deck are little tiny guys that either already have Infect or they have some kind of like little proliferate triggers or some kind of things going on that aren't really going to get you a ton of poison if you were to hit your opponent with it. The idea here is to have somebody either swing at you and then you give your creature Infect on the block, or you swing into them and give it Infect at instant speed to like severely damage one of their bigger creatures or tear into one of their creatures. And then you're going to get the negative counters, you're going to get the synergies with the snakes, you're going to get... A good thing here is to have Nest of Scarabs out and get a bunch of Scarab tokens off of this. There's just a bunch of applications outside of poisoning somebody with it. Next, we're going to move into some of the Eventide stuff. This is Crumbling Ashes. For 1 and a black, you get an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy target creature with a -1/-1 counter on it. Now, you have to be very careful with this card. I don't normally run this in my version. I've tried it a few times, but I don't usually use it because you do not get a choice on the matter of whether or not you destroy a creature. If you don't have a negative counter on one of their creatures and you do, your creature gets to die because you have to do this. It is not a may effect. So you have to be careful because a lot of the creatures, especially from the Amonkhet and Outer Devastation stuff that's in the deck, they are, enters the battlefield, put a counter on one of your guys, or if Hapatra swings and hits and you don't have anything else to put the counter on, you're going to have to put it on one of your things if you want the snakes and the scarab tokens coming off. So you might have a situation where you're blowing your own stuff up, and you've got to be careful with that. Next up, we have what gives the snakes their plane, Eldrazi Monument. For 5 colorless. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and have flying and indestructible. And at the beginning of your upkeep, sack a creature. If you can't, sacrifice the monument. So the idea here is that you give the snakes +1/+1 in flying, and then they also have indestructible. So they're indestructible flying death touchers. So they're not really going to want to block your stuff because they're going to lose their stuff and you're not going to lose your snakes. But at the same time, you're putting pressure on their life total, and it's just a fun thing. And then there's also a trick that I actually pull off in this deck. I've done it one other time that this will set up, and I'll explain it when we get to the card. Next, we have Dusk Urchins. For 2 and a black, you get a 4/3 oof that says whenever Dusk Urchins attacks or blocks, put a -1/-1 counter on it. So every turn you attack with it or block with it, it gets a little smaller. Then when it is put into a graveyard from play, you draw a card for each -1/-1 counter on it. So the idea here is to be able to either free swing through with, like the Eldrazi Monument or something like that. It gets a little smaller, but then as it starts to die, you're going to get cards off of it. So ideally, if you let it just get all the way down to the 3rd counter and it dies, you're going to draw 3 cards as soon as it dies. Stepping aside from the negative counter upgrades for the deck, this is one of my favorite cards in this deck to actually draw cards using the negative counter synergies. Generous Patron. This is from Battle Bond. For 2 and a green, you get a 1/4 Elf Advisor that when it enters the battlefield, support 2. So you put +1/+1 counters on each of the 2 other target creatures. So you can put them on other creatures other than yours to draw cards, but I would rather do that part for my creatures because the extra part on this is what we want. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, draw a card. So if you do like a mass negative counter sweep with something like the Carnifex Demon, every creature you don't control that gets a negative counter, you'll get to draw a card off of Generous Patron. And on top of that, it has a big enough toughness that you can do that several times before the patron will die. If you really want to create chaos, though, with negative counters, this card's going to do it for us with Blowfly Infestation. For 2 and a black, you get an enchantment that says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, if it had a -1/-1 counter on it, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. So you can actually start chaining these things onto other creatures. And like if you do a mass sweep and like take out like 3 or 4 creatures, then you can start just going, okay, counter there, counter there, counter there. And then they start stacking up. Oh, that creature died. Now I get another trigger and counter there, counter there. You can almost do a complete board wipe with Blowfly Infestation and a mass negative counter dump on all of the board. Speaking of a mass counter dump, first off, this guy's on the reserve list, but he's actually quite cheap. He's only like $2 or $3 right now. Harbinger of Night. For 2 black, you get a 2/3 spirit that says during your upkeep, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature. So this, during your upkeep, it's just going to dump a counter on everything, and then it'll do it again. So like if you don't have any way to bolster Hapatra's toughness, she's going to die on the 2nd trigger, and then this dies on the 3rd trigger. So you kind of have to time your stuff a little bit with her. But every time this comes down, it's like, oh, negative counters. I get a bunch of snakes. Okay, next upkeep, it's going to hit again. All of your stuff's actually going to get hit again, but then you already had that snake burst. So that's going to basically double your snakes up on that next hit as long as Hapatra's around. And it just keeps rolling along the counters for us. Now this one works a little better with Hapatra since she's black and green. This is Midnight Banshee. For 3 black, you get a 5/5 spirit with Wither, which means it deals damage in the form of -1/-1 counters. So that helps us on that front for putting counters on our opponent's creatures if they block or we swing into them. It also has at the beginning of your upkeep, put a -1/-1 counter on each non-black creature. So if your opponents aren't playing black, they're going to get severely punished by Midnight Banshee. It'll also put the counters on our snakes because those are green, but then it will get all those snakes back with Hapatra sitting around. So it's not like it's a huge deal. We can kind of chain them together. And then if this gets out of hand, we can try to sacrifice it and draw cards off of it or whatever we're doing. This is the card I was referring to earlier with the combo with the Eldrazi Monument. This was a dumb thing. I was using Tooth and Nail in the deck and didn't realize I had this at hand. But for 2 black, you get Soul Snuffers, a 3/3 elemental shaman that when it enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature. Well, being that the monument made the snakes 2/2s, when I dropped the Soul Snuffers, it actually just turned all of my snakes into 1/1s, and then I got another bunch of snakes. Well, the Tooth and Nail that I used, I entwine it for the Soul Snuffers and a Crater Hoof. So then I got basically an extra burst of like 20 snakes across the board, and then I resolved the trigger on the thing and just slammed into my opponents. I think they were like 28 snakes when all was said and done. Next up, we have Contagion Clasp. If for 2 colorless, you get an artifact that says when it enters the battlefield, put a counter on a creature, the -1/1s, and then you can pay 4 and tap it to proliferate, which is nice because then you can start, getting those counters rolling after the fact. So this is just the baby brother of the next card we're going to talk about, and it's very, very good, and it's also very, very expensive right now, and that's Contagion Engine. For 6 colorless, you get an artifact that when it enters the battlefield, put a negative counter on each creature a target player controls, and then it's pay 4 tap, and then proliferate again. So it's just basically do it twice for the same activation as the Contagion Clasp. This is one of the bread and butter cards of this deck. It is one of the best cards that you can do with Hapatra Vizier of Poisons, because if someone's like, oh, I'm playing tokens and I got a bunch of stuff, you can basically wipe out all their little doinks, or at least weaken them if they're playing Anthem effects. You're going to get a ton of snakes, because for every counter, that's a snake. For every counter, that's a scarab insect token off of the nest of scarabs. There's just a lot of functionality that comes off of this thing. And then you can double proliferate if you have enough mana. So late game, this thing can actually put 3 negative counters on your opponent's stuff if you actually have 10 mana laying around. And then it gets you all that added value. And then the last card that I would definitely recommend for this deck, and it is a missing board wipe for the version on Arena, Black Sun's Zenith. For X black, you get a sorcery where you put X -1/-1 counters on each creature and then shuffle it into its owner's library. This is by far the best negative counter spell in the entire game right now, because they just don't use the negative counters very often. And it is going to give you so much value, because you don't even have to use it as a board wipe if you don't need to. Like, say you have a board full of stuff and you want to just ramp it up and trigger a bunch of stuff, just do it for 1. Just pay 3 mana, X is 1, and you are off to the races. You get your snakes, you get that scarab token off there, you get the obelisk spider pinging your opponent repeatedly. There's just a lot of function here. Or you can just go ham and just dump as much mana into that X as you can, and you're going to generate, snakes off of Hapatra. You're only going to get 1 snake per creature getting counters, but if the nest of scarabs is out, you're going to get a ton of scarabs off of it. So as I'm editing this video together, I realized I left one of the cards I wanted to put in the list, and I'm going to go ahead and just tack it on here at the end. That card is Necroskidder. For 1 black, you get a 1/4 elemental with Wither that says whenever a creature an opponent controls with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you may return that card to the battlefield under your control. So this one can be a little controversial depending on how your playgroup is about you taking their stuff. Some playgroups don't like theft decks. Some people don't like you touching their cards. And this thing is also very, very hard to resolve on spell table. So depending on where you're playing the deck, I would not include this if it's a group that's kind of touchy. But if your playgroup likes that kind of thing and doesn't care, then by all means, go ahead and include the card. So what do you think? I absolutely adore this deck in paper, and I think it's very, very competitive. It's not a C EDH deck, but it can be treated as a high-powered EDH deck. As such, I hope you enjoyed this little bit of an upgrade to a commander version of this deck, and I will see you guys in the next video.